Hello, sir. Wait a minute. Oh, that's much better. To remind myself. Well, Laura, Owen, Eric, Maddie, hi. Here we are again. We're slowly getting a handle on it. But hopefully by now you've seen our last chapter, our installment. This time, which actually represents, I believe, our next to the last session. I think we've got one more. And then for session 15, I suspect we're going to go ahead and just call the final, our last session. We were just going to look through some of our integrating theology and ministry questions. You guys are actually good enough at that. I'm not too worried about you. Boy, have I had fun discussing with you guys the questions that we did. This is the first time we've run that 3-credit class. I'm really tickled. I think that was a real good outcome. So the details for closing up the semester in the next couple weeks will come to you via email, so check your emails. And in the meantime, I want to share one or two more of these actual lecture instructions with you, just to touch on some of the areas that you will probably be encountering no matter what sort of ministry that you're involved with in the future. In the meantime, let's just ask a little quick word of blessing. Father, thank you for letting us finish this semester, even if we're kind of hobbling and limping across the finish line. Please use what we have learned this semester in all our classes, both teaching and studenting. Please help us to use these things in our witness of your lordship to other human beings as we move along in our lives. We love you. We ask your Spirit to inhabit our time, our study, our conversation. And we ask, Lord, that you would take pleasure in our desire to serve you well. We love you and we thank you for the opportunity. In Jesus' name. Okay, well, here we go. Kick back. See, you could watch this at home. You could be having hot dogs. You could be having popcorn. I'd try that, but as you saw with the mask, that would compromise the integrity of my delivery. What we're looking at this week is cross-cultural ministry. Again, I know some of you counseling students have looked at this, but in terms of ministering cross-culturally from a pastoral perspective, which can include not just counseling, not just ministering to different ethnic groups that live here in the Rogue Valley, but might actually include work in a literal cross-cultural context. I've been to Haiti, I've been to Mexico, well, I've been to Tunisia and Turkey and Italy and Jordan and Egypt. All of those are difficult places to do any kind of a cross-cultural ministry. Excuse me. Just finished filming the history class, so I'm a little worn out. But in whatever context you find yourself, these are interesting things about other cultures to be aware of and will inform your labors in any number of different contexts. So, get your notes on cross-cultural ministry. Let's take a look at these. Introduction, looking at the purpose first of cross-cultural ministry. No surprises here. To better love people whose cultural values are not our own. Boy, you could be just stuck in the Rogue Valley, or you could be in Timbuktu with this one. 2, to grow more effective in carrying the gospel outward, becoming to all things to all people, that we might save some. Can't say it any plainer, guys. This is about making ourselves better tools, more easily heard by people of cultures other than our own. And that's not something that happens by accident. Even in the Spirit, it can use all the preparation we can give it. And last but not least, to fulfill the Great Commission. That's why we do this. That's why we would be open to an opportunity for cross-cultural ministry. Because it's hard. It's frustrating. It can be maddening sometimes. With language difficulties, it can just drive you insane. And there are all kinds of things, but we're going to look at some of them today so you won't be blindsided if and when these things you are exposed to them. I have to say that there has been a wide spectrum of historical experience in the practice and outreach of Christian missions. You know, in the beginning, the classical age, the apostolic age, the early Middle Ages, we actually had some pretty successful protocols and models, prototypes even, of missions that worked well. The apostles operating in the Mediterranean basin were dealing with people, all of whom spoke Greek, all of whom were familiar with their culture. And so that early apostolic outreach was quite fruitful. Sadly, it ended up in everybody's death through martyrdom, except John's. They tried to kill him, but the Lord kept him alive, still had revelation to do. But eventually, even when they ran out of that Greco-Roman bubble and started moving into the barbarian lands and into India and deeper into Africa, the apostles and those who followed them were able to craft a pretty good protocol for outreach, not really carrying with them the need to turn people into little Romans or little Greeks like we often try to do and turn people into little Americans or little Europeans. Patrick is one of the best. He just showed up on Ireland's shores, convinced all he needed to do was preach Christ and him crucified. And it took over a whole civilization. The Celtic wave, if you will, actually ended up evangelizing most of northern Europe. Included the Vikings, the Saxons, some of the nastiest Germanic barbarians there were. And those guys largely became Christians, in the next few centuries. Well, and you have, Ulfilas, who went up and invented a new language for the Goths. Sadly, taught them to be Aryans instead of real Christians. But the early church had some really successful paradigms. And even later, Hudson Taylor's decision to go inland. Amazing, and just adopting the culture of the Chinese on that level. That sort of non-impositional cross-culture outreach was very fruitful, but we have had some real missional train wrecks. I just finished teaching on the Enlightenment and the Darwinistic, social Darwinism, the fruit of the Enlightenment in history, and the damage that was done for us to assume that we were more highly evolved. We really hurt a lot of cultures that might otherwise have benefited from our presentation of the gospel story. The American natives suffered badly as a result of this. I won't even speak of the Aztecs and the Incas. The Aborigines, the African natives, all of these people suffered by really what ended up being that sense of racial Darwinistic superiority, in which we felt not only do we need to give them Christ and him crucified, but they need to wear coats and tails, they need to speak English, they need to be able to balance their checkbook, they need to look and act and speak like us. That was a hideous mistake, and it cost many people. Don't know the permanent eternal outlook of those souls, but I pray that God was merciful to those who earlier Christians hurt. Well, the current consensus for missions as such, although we don't really have a class on that so much, but we are now focused on unreached people groups. We've decided that rather than send a missionary who's going to waste 10 years just learning how to hold his teacup without offending people, how to speak the language, we find a person who is already a member of that culture who comes to Christ. That's the person to support and put all of our training and resources, teaching, money, everything we've got, prayer, put all of that at the disposal of this national evangelist who already knows how to move around in this culture. That has been the big shift in the last 50 years. It calls for humility and a willingness to make provision without requiring a whole lot of earthly return as a result. That's hard to come by, but it has proved a better mechanism for the delivery of the gospel in the last 50 years than almost anything else that we have accomplished. So, just so you understand, that's kind of the paradigm we're operating with, but it still behooves us to be familiar with some of the elements involved, some of the ingredients that we'll need to cook this stew. We are looking at a missions environment in flux, by the way. We ourselves are in the midst of a cultural shift of monumental, almost biblical proportions. We have postmodern pluralism, a sort of a radical pluralism that makes no distinctions of value or right or wrong between different cultures. That in itself militates against the outpouring of the gospel, because we're, just by sharing our testimony in Christ, we're presumed to be presuming a superiority, the fact that we're right and their pagan religion is wrong. Well, okay, yeah, I do. I think sacrificing screaming infants to Molech in the fire, I think that's wrong. Very interesting that when you point out some of the cultural practices, the binding of Chinese women's feet, the burning of Indian widows, the genital disfiguration of African women, the stoning of 12-year-old rape victims in the Middle East, that all of these things will call upon condemnation from the liberal views, but that makes them guilty of the same thing that we're doing. Discriminating based on our evaluation that, no, this behavior is not good. Slavery is not good. Chopping people's heads off is not good. So again, it's part of the cognitive dissonance that characterizes our current culture. You know, our nation is changing too, becoming highly diversified in terms of ethnicity, terms of religious preference, faith communities, just in terms of understanding, in terms of worldview. I mean, we've all looked at that. It's getting to be a pretty, well, hobo stew would be a kind description for the mulligan that we are rapidly becoming. Because one of the problems is we no longer are honoring the idea of acculturation. The word assimilation has become a pejorative, has become a bad word, and which is really sad, because for several centuries, most all of the races that have reached these shores have successfully assimilated. The natives, the blacks, those are two that have really struggled, and there are reasons for that, which hopefully, God willing, we can address more effectively in the future. But again, all of those, that's the mistake of the Red Road and the Black Lives Matter movements, is it's a very limited view, myopic almost, of the main problem. They're seeing it as black versus white, or white versus red, or red versus brown versus black. That's not the problem. The problem is good versus evil. It is purity, righteousness versus wrongdoing, iniquity. And it takes on every color of the human rainbow. Every ethnicity is represented. So getting people to realize that there are loving people and there are hateful people of every stamp, every culture, every skin color. Oh, that's quite a job. And we've got our work cut out for us. And as far as the world itself changing, good Lord, I can't keep track of it geopolitically. We are in a mess. The digital revolution has ushered in some very good things, but as we have seen through this last election cycle, it has ushered in some very terrible things as well. The whole idea of truth is up for grabs. We're traveling so much anymore that, why, if we're not careful, one day we'll experience a global pandemic. What do you think of that? And this one's not the last one we'll experience. So modernizing has solved a lot of problems, but it has created a new share that we will have to look at. Economic entitlement, economic differentiation, the growing gap between those who are rich and those who are poor, all of those things are going to be issues that we'll have to deal with. So we are, as ministers of Christ, we're in a very liquid situation. We're literally in the soup, trying to figure out, is it getting warmer? Is it getting cooler? Do we need more salt? What's going on? How do we make this work? How do we take the gospel to the ends of the earth? And we're doing our best. Frankly, it's a struggle just to keep up a faithful representation here in the valley. But I think we're doing a good job of that. And I think God is really coming to our rescue. He has been very gentle in the whole progress of our COVID adventure. Well, if that gives you just a quick introduction to what we're trying to do here in terms of looking at cross-cultural missions, ministry, that kind of sums it up. We've looked at the purpose. We've seen that we've got a lot of problems on our hands. We have a long batting average of both success and failure, and we have a very volatile situation currently in which to direct our efforts. So having looked at that, having kind of set the guidelines, we can look at cultural structure. This is our examination of what makes a culture. In teaching that counseling class, I had to do a little bit more study, and you can actually, the word culture has quite a semantic domain. You can apply it to an individual, or you can apply it to an entire nation. You can apply it to even a limited community of some kind, because it's a very liquid thing. But most of those cultures, even from the individual to the larger, does have some common elements that it can share. And we're going to look at most of those, at least the big ones. The first is being worldview. We're going to spend a lot of time explaining that because you guys have never had the worldview class. Wait, you have? You have had worldview? All of you? Well, okay. Moving on to the next page. Worldview, you remember, it's the lens we see through. It's the operating system through which we perceive, we process, we digest, and we regard the things that we experience. It's a conscious process. It is also an unconscious process. It's got a lot of ingredients in that particular stew. Well, looking at the individual level, again, this does not surprise you guys. Just review. Subconscious values, assumptions, and allegiances are just as important as decisions, evaluations, conscious beliefs. Everyone has a worldview. It's usually inherited. It's rarely invented. I don't know if I've shared with you guys that roughly 2/3 of people end up dying in the faith community into which they were born. But another third change their faith community, either coming to another faith, coming to Christ, or coming out of Christianity and coming to another faith. A worldview is rarely examined. It's rarely analyzed. It's like living in the penthouse and going down and wading through the moss and the stink and the mildew and the spider poop and webs to check out the basement. Nobody wants to go down there. What if I find rats? What if I find broken pipes? I don't want to do that. I'll let the janitor deal with that. Well, no, we have to go down and look. It's important. We'll be happy we did. Because we use worldview to evaluate everything else. And it's really a good idea to have a worldview that's tuned up and in calibration with reality and in calibration with a biblical framework. Well, from a cultural level, there are similar elements in a culture that are stored in myth and the things we hope to be true, wish to believe, even if we don't trust them. There are things in our literature, there are things in our art. At the cultural level, these artifacts, if you will, reflect our shared beliefs and values. Most of us in this country actually like this country. There are many, whether that's an increasing number or not, who have been taught to despise the country they live in. That's very sad. But that is where we are. Most of us share hopes and ambitions not only for our culture, but for our nation and indeed for ourselves. It's okay. We share some real basic elements with our general culture. Because one thing our culture isn't aware of is how many elements they base their worldview on, which proceed directly from a Christian understanding. That's why we've tried to democratize so many countries. We keep thinking it's going to take. Well, no, that's a plant that only grows in the soil that has been cultivated, watered, and weeded by the Word of God. You try that in Vietnam or Thailand or Burma or Chechnya or the Sudan, you're going to come up south. It's not going to work because there's no soil there for it. Not historically, not socially, not spiritually, at least not yet. Well, the reason that these common hopes and ambitions are important, what they do is they provide a critical foundation for a culture to labor in a common direction, to labor on common goals, so that everybody, say in America, theoretically, is working to procure protection and honor and provision for everybody, for every citizen. Okay, ideally that doesn't actually work, or practically that doesn't work. Ideally, we hope that it would. If we were all had the same hopes and ambitions and were following the same understanding and common goals, it would. But we cripple along as we can. The fragmentation that we are experiencing as a result of the digital age and of this radical pluralism that is being taught and endorsed largely by academia and the cultural elites of entertainment and social media, that's hurting us. It is making communication difficult, creating social tension, nearly almost busted us apart in this last election. Again, very sad. Where are we headed? Well, the long term, I can tell you, I'm headed for the marriage supper. I hope you guys are too. But I'd like to drag along as many of my unbelieving loved ones as I possibly could. So we'll see. That's my goal. Let's talk about, you'll like this, a cultural minister, cross-culture sociologist Bunkowski. I forget his first name. He came up with this idea, the cultural onion. That each culture is like an onion or like an iceberg. Most of it is hidden. You see only a small visible portion of that. You see the actualizing level. That's the outer level where artifacts are found, objects. What is valued? What is collected? What do people dress like? What do they eat? What's their art look like? What do their homes look like? What are the status symbols that they seek to acquire? All of those would come under the artifact level of the actualizing level. The other are their behaviors. You can see their behaviors. How do they treat each other? How do they regard authority? How do they view government? The individualistic or are they submissive? What about their friends? How do they behave in the family? How do they worship? How do they work? All of these things, again, are still in the actualizing level that is visible to us, but they involve people's behaviors. So their artifacts and their behaviors are in the actualizing outer layers of this onion. They are the portions of any person's culture that we can see and experience visibly, tactily. Beneath these, we have a deeper layer that primarily is responsible for evaluating. And under there, we have an area that evaluates feelings, a layer of the skin that evaluates our emotions. What is enjoyable versus what is distressing? What do I find pleasant versus what do I find annoying? That's a big one. What are our values? That layer of the skin right there in the evaluating level tells us about morality. What is right? What is wrong? We have feelings, values, our beliefs. about truth. What is true? What is false? How do we determine that? What criteria do we use at that level of our onion? What does that culture use at that level in the onion? So we have the actualizing level at the surface of the onion. Deeper into the body of the onion, we have the evaluating level. And at the core of the onion are our foundational beliefs. And this is where the soup gets pretty thick. This is where the bones and the big pieces of meat lie. This is in the worldview core of a human being and of a culture. It's what sets it apart. It's what stamps it in a signature characteristic that makes it different from everybody else, every other culture. It reflects the focus of visceral subconscious beliefs. So, I don't know if they have a thing for old Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner cartoons that they've forgotten about as a child. That's part of that hidden worldview. They will always favor a Warner Brothers cartoon over something new, and be surprised that they did. Sorry, it's a lame illustration, but you get what I'm talking about. So our worldview is reality. What is real versus what is illusion? We could have used a little bit more of that in the election. Okay, also, where is our ultimate allegiance? Bottom line, short answer, ultimately, is this about God? Do I acknowledge a creator? Or is this about me? Am I my own God? That's the biggest difference that we find between both broader cultures and within that culture, each individual human being. Just so. Excuse me a moment. Well, cross-cultural growth, if those are the basic elements of cross-culture according to Bunkowski, our cross-cultural growth involves you and me. It's how we grow in our ability to communicate across cultural barriers. And I'm willing to guess that all of you are already aware that that's like twice as hard as communicating with just people in our group, in our circle. Maybe 3 times as hard at the best. Now this cross-cultural process, this is by a guy named Elmer. I've got the book titles for you if you like. This is a progression of experience and interpretation. Here's how he would describe it. Your cross-cultural process begins with your acculturation as just a member of your own culture. You're affected by the culture you grow up in, whether you like it or not. We're all products of our culture, at least to some degree. So we have expectations. We expect others that we meet to perceive and interpret and behave as we do. That's our bottom line default situation. That's our default setting. Our actions are often based on our expectation being met or disappointed. You know, if I'm out and about on the mall and I just look over and ask somebody, hey, pal, you got the time? And if he shines me on, I'm irritated. My expectation is that it doesn't cost you anything. You could have told me it's 2 o'clock. You could even have lied and smiled and gone away and I wouldn't have discovered it till later. But I had an expectation that that's a civil exchange. Maybe you wouldn't exactly expect it if you were pulled off the road changing a tire, somebody pulled up behind you and offered to help. That'd be a little bit above and beyond. But those are things that we have been taught in our culture, and we recognize them as commonalities. We recognize them as things that are good. They're behaviors we expect. And there are the behaviors that we see. Somebody steals your parking lot at Costco, so you get out and shoot them in the head. Well, maybe not. You visualize that, but you don't actually get around to doing that. But that's rude. I mean, you wouldn't do that, hopefully. You wouldn't do that to somebody. But again, we have expectations of people. And when they don't meet our expectations in their responses to our words and actions, that leads to a little bit of friction. Well, this leads us to a very important concept called attribution. Now, I might be slightly justified in leaping to a certain judgment if on Highway 62, somebody with Oregon plates pulls over right in front of me and I have to kind of slam on my brakes. I am not unjustified in presuming, well, that guy's a moron. What kind of dork is he? Those are not unjustified. What he did was, he knows better than that. I would know better than to do that, although I've done it once or twice. That's justified, at least in part. But here's the problem. I do it like that, which is normally how we do it. All of this is automatic. So my attribution of idiot motives for this guy ahead of me that cut me off in this culture might be appropriate. At least I got a good chance it's appropriate. When I'm overseas and I reach into the chip and dip in the middle of the table with my left hand holding a chip, and I dip out a big bunch of goo and bring it to my lips, and I look around and everybody's aghast with open jaws looking at me wide-eyed. I can jump to the conclusion, what's wrong with you guys? What I'm not realizing is I've just violated a huge rule of etiquette, because in this culture, the left hand is normally associated with cleaning your bottom after you go to the bathroom. I didn't know that. Well, multiply that by 1 billion examples of behavior, and you can see where my jumping to a conclusion in that context is not productive. Not only is it not productive, it's not justified. Not only is it not productive and not justified, it doesn't correspond to reality. I'm in the wrong place to make that judgment. The context is all different. Misattribution is the most difficult thing about cross-cultural ministry. Misattribution is responsible for more missional failure. I should go farther than that. Misattribution is responsible for more communication failure in the entire human race than almost any other single factor. We leap to a judgment, we assign the wrong motive, we assign the wrong meaning, we misinterpret someone's goal and judge quickly what they said or what they did. That happens to us here in the Rogue Valley, even at PBC. When we try and pull that off in Tunisia or Malaysia or India or Japan, guys, you're dead before you leave the starting gate. It's so different and so complex, you have to get a handle on that. You must put a speed bump in front of your attributive process. And that's what familiarity is about. By learning more about the culture, by assuming quite a bit more humility and willingness to understand there are complexities here I don't fully comprehend. By your being willing to do that, you slow down the attributive process, which reduces the number and instance of your misattributions, reduces their severity even, and increases your chance at really communicating across culture. So the value here is in understanding how different another culture is, putting on the brakes and building a speed bump, so that your reaction to words or actions that you don't understand in a different cultural context is kind of a freeze. Thinking, okay, what could that have mean? What could that have meant? Why is this person spitting on me? Oh, in this context, it means good luck. They're protecting me from the evil eye spirit. Well, who knew? but only by sitting still for a minute, getting that first signal, that guy's spitting on you, you should jump him. No, okay, no, speed bump, speed bump. Why did you spit on me? Oh, I'm making you safe from evil eye spirit. Oh, okay, I'll wear a jacket next time. It's that simple. I mean, it really is, because it takes a long time to get these signals down, guys. Let's take a look at them. Here is cross-culture in ministry. Sometimes I don't know what I mean by these headings. I'll have to redo these notes. But increased immigration and pluralism has heightened ethnic accessibility here. Okay, I get that. Gosh, in Oregon, I think there might have been 3 people in Oregon 30, 40 years ago who weren't white. Well, that's changed. I don't know, no, there were quite a few Hispanics, but even so, that's changed. There are more Hispanics. There are more blacks. I'm seeing so many Washington and California license plates now that I'm a little nervous about getting out in the parking lot at Costco. We have accessibility to a number of ethnic groups and a number of different cultural subgroups today that were not here 20, 30, 40 years ago. Postmodern cultural diversity has increased social fragmentation. The cultural movement towards that radical pluralism that we talked about, we have less cohort commonality. People, especially on social media, tend to watch what they already believe. And not only that, if you have not gone on Netflix and watched The Social Dilemma, please hear me, you should do that tonight. You understand about computers feeding you, you buy a microwave and for the next 2 weeks, microwaves and their ads keep showing up in your news feed. That's happening on a scale you can't comprehend. And I really wish you would watch this program just to get a handle on it. It's why 2 people can subscribe to the same news feed, but this guy's a little liberal, this guy's a little conservative. They get 2 completely news feeds. Even if it's CNN or Fox, they're completely different. This guy is getting everything that feeds him paying more attention to this channel, which is anger, stress, shock. He stays on the channel longer when he sees something that makes him mad. The computer keeps track of that and keeps sending him stuff like that to keep him on the channel. Where will that take you? That's like this program, which I want you to watch. Even the CEOs and the software engineers at Google, at Amazon, at Twitter, all these places are not happy. They're a little nervous about where this is going. And many of them don't let their kids even use social media because of this. Please, just check that out. The Social Dilemma on Netflix. It's not long, but I think you'll enjoy it. But that's one of the things that has happened. Younger kids don't listen to the teenagers. Teenagers don't listen to the grown-ups. There used to be interchange between these various cohorts, these various groups. They're not there anymore. The kids are just talking to each other. You've seen it at McDonald's, a group of junior high guys, they all get their phone out. They're just talking to each other. They're not interfacing with anybody else, so they don't get new information. They only reinforce what they already believe. That's going on in a big way, and it has really hurt biblical literacy and general cultural knowledge. It's made it harder to share the gospel in this culture from wherever you are. Our cross-cultural skill sets are now critical even for local outreach. Just to talk to a group of kids hanging out outside La Clinica, you need to have a clue. Not just about gang things and drug things and Hispanic things and Bible things. You need to know a lot about that culture, what it values, what's important to it, what it recognizes. Knowing Spanish would not be a bad idea in that case. I'm embarrassed that I don't know Spanish. I took it in high school, and which reminds me of a funny joke. You know what you call somebody that speaks 3 languages? Trilingual, right? Okay. What do you call somebody that speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. Yeah. What do you call somebody that speaks 1 language? An American. Sorry. I'm okay. I'm better now. I'm doing the best I can here. I'm trying to make this easy on you guys, okay? Let's look at something a guy named Livermore came up with. This is actually kind of interesting. Cultural intelligence quota. Again, I've got all these books if any of this interests you. Or CQ. Livermore calls cross-culture potential and capacity. And he divided it into 4 elements that you should know. Actually, I've got 3 listed here, but I'll tell you the 4th when we get done. First is your knowledge cultural quotient. And all that is, that's the raw information you got out of Wikipedia. That's everything you know about that culture. You've read in books, you've seen on TV, you've heard, you've studied. All the stuff that's just information download. You know all these things about a culture, its customs, its values, its roles, its history. There's also an interpretive cultural quotient. That deals with your ability to recognize the dynamics of this happening in an actual human interchange. Do you actually recognize when this custom is being honored, or when this value is being recognized, or when this dynamic is in play? Do you know when to smile? Do you know when to bow? Do you know when to put your shoes back on? That's the interpretive, is recognizing the context within which these dynamics connect with each other. Not even doing them correctly, just recognizing them. And we're going to get into a fun project that helps with this. Representing awareness of complexities and difficulties involved in specific intercultural interface. Okay, there's one I got to share with you. I forget what book it was in, but it was about space, personal space that people need. And somebody was reviewing security camera footage of a conference room that a couple of executives were in, just having a private meeting. It wasn't even a meeting. And it was a Japanese guy and an American guy, and they're negotiating some trade thing. And if you speed up the security footage, it's a big conference room, it's a big table in the middle. And they start out, and the American guy, he kind of keeps backing up, and the Japanese guy keeps closing in, getting right in his face. And the American guy will back up a little bit more, and the Japanese guy, closes in without thinking about it. And you speed this up, and the Japanese guy is chasing the American all over around the conference room, completely around the table, over the course of a 12-minute discussion. I mean, it's kind of like that Family Circus cartoon on Sunday Comics, where you're watching where Billy's gone all through the neighborhood. Looking at that and realizing what's at play, that the American personal space is much larger than the standard Japanese understanding of personal space. They're more crowded on that little island. They really don't give a hoot about personal space. But looking at that and recognizing that's what's at play, that is part of your interpretive cultural quotient. You're aware, oh, that's what's going on. Your behavioral cultural quotient is being the American in that room and not moving backwards. Letting the Japanese company salesman get right in your face and recognizing, you know what, this is okay for him. He doesn't mind doing this. This is normal for him. And I want to make him comfortable. Might even get a chance to share the gospel. Okay, I'm going to tolerate something that's a little out of my comfort zone, and I'm just going to change my behavior and allow this to be my acceptable personal space for now. That's behavioral cultural quotient. Your ability to do that, to respond to your correct interpretation of the dynamics with the appropriate behavior. And you learn to eat and dip your chip with the right hand. And you learn to do a whole lot of other things. The fourth one that I don't have on your notes, and you might as well know, he calls it the perseverance cultural quotient. All he means by that is your ability, once you know you're going to have long-term exposure to a different culture, it is your ability to persevere, knowing how difficult and drawn out this process is going to be. This sinks half of the long-term missionaries that we send overseas. Half of them are back within 6 months saying, I just can't take it. It's too different, it's too weird. So all of these, your knowledge, interpretive, behavioral, and even your persevering cultural quotient, according to Livermore's formula here, will determine your ability to succeed in penetrating the barriers of cross-cultural communication. Well, I got a couple things I want to share. These don't take too long, so we'll be able to get out of here. These are some cultural elements that are worthy of our individual attention. One, possibly the most generalized, is the idea of cultural context. Now, you can have a low context culture. Americans have it. The Aboriginal peoples have it. Native Americans, whatnot. The Latino culture is very low context. The Irish, I'm afraid, are very, very low context. All this means this culture is informally casual. It is marked by an ease of personal address. People are very quickly on a first name basis. Common association, familiarity, very little standoffishness, very little social distance. Maybe they're doing social distancing with the COVID, but normally they wouldn't mind bellying up to the bar together. There's a lot of social warmth, you know, touching another person's elbow or crowding into them, you know, in a crowded elevator is just not the end of the world. So very informally casual, very risk tolerant. People in low context cultures, they're not that weirded out by taking risks. They're not that put off by the idea of failure or even crisis. Just adapt, we'll just deal with it. That's cool. They're prone to candid disclosure, and actually they're pretty prone to passionate expression. So they're risk tolerant, they're informally casual, they are spontaneous. On the whole, a low context culture is a spontaneous culture. They're comfortable with transparency. They're not really devastated by a little ambiguity in the situation. They'll just, whatever, it'll become clearer. They tend to be reactive to stimuli. They tend to be quick on their feet, which means they're also able to change direction rather quickly. Obstacle, I'll just go around. I'll do it the other way. All of these would characterize a low context culture. And if you're in a low context culture as an American, half your battle is won because you already know how to operate in a lot of these situations. And you'll find a lot of commonality with the behaviors and artifacts expressed by this cultural onion that you're looking at. There are also high context cultures. These would primarily be found in the Oriental cultures. They'd be found in European cultures, especially German and English. They are very formally defined. There is a primacy placed on etiquette, protocol, very rigid observance of proper address, relational procedures. Randall does a regular, and Terry, both do regular appearances over in Nepal. And they one of the things is they have students that they've taught for years. And they encourage them, like we do here, you know, to address Oh no, just call me Randall. Don't call me, Professor Gleason. They can't do it. They can't do it. They are scope locked on the necessity of addressing a person according to their correct title. It's just they're not able to be that socially informal. It's very much like what we see on Downton Abbey or any of the upstairs, downstairs, masterpiece theater stuff. Very rigid class divides, very formal observation of politeness, of manners, of etiquette. They are very risk averse. They prefer shallow, safe conversations. Boy, in England, it'll be a while before you get to call somebody by their first name, maybe a couple of years. That is less happening now. England is in a cultural metamorphosis of its own over the last couple decades, but it's still something. You don't address somebody by their first name right out of the gate. It is about safe conversation, a calm, stoic demeanor, stiff upper lip. Conflict avoidance. People tend to shy away from open conflict. They'd rather not carry so much risk of violating etiquette and compromising behavior. They go for high certainty outcomes. They will follow orders because they like the idea that even if they fail, somebody else will get the blame. Interestingly, this is one of the reasons D-Day worked for us in World War II, is when our lieutenants and captains got killed, our sergeants and corporals didn't bat an eye. Come on, man, you go to the left, right, and I'll go to the left, and take out a field of fire on that machine gun. They didn't even wait. Now, Germans, if you shot their lieutenant, maybe they had an old sergeant, pray they did, he might keep them alive, but they were paralyzed when they lost the chain of command. The privates just had no idea, would never even presume to take the initiative. And that, in large part, is why the Allies were able to get such a beachhead foothold on Normandy and Europe on D-Day, is the Germans were really slow to react beyond what they had the authority to do. Oh, man, good thing. Well, high context cultures are also very ritualistic. There's a tendency towards highly choreographed events. Interfaces are, diplomatic interfaces are very rigid, very detailed planning, and the emphasis is on appearance. The prime minister may be dying of pancreatic cancer, but he's still going to sit there and shake the premier's hand and smile and nod, and no matter how much pain he's in, he's going to get her done. And when it's over, he'll go off and go back to his sickbed. Really, really interesting dynamics at work here. Now, in terms of specific, within the idea of cultural context, some of the specific things that you should tick off your checklist as you're entering a different culture. One, what is this culture's view of self? How do they view their self? Are they individual or are they collective? Are they individuals like here in America, John Wayne, cowboy, guy rides off by himself into the sunset, as opposed to Japan, where if I dishonor my family, if I fail in my role within the community, I'm going to commit hara-kiri. My job is to do my job. That's a collective culture. Is your role value as a person or as a member of a greater collective? There is also the issue of privacy versus communality. This would regard visibility, high profile. How high profile do you want to be? No, I don't. I just want to stay in my cubicle. What kind of personal space do you need? We've already talked about that. Japanese guy doesn't need much personal space. We need a lot. Ambition versus duty. Does this culture allow you the freedom to follow your dream? Or if you're born to the taco salesman on the corner, does that mean that 20 years later, you're going to inherit the stand and carry on the family tradition of being the taco vendor on the corner? And if you try to leave that, you'll hurt the family and hurt everybody because you abandon us. Where's the emphasis? Do you have that freedom or do you not? Is the view of your culture, even if it's not your particular view, is the view of your culture you as a member of the community or you as an individual? That's a big one, guys. What is their view of power? Is it egalitarian or is it elitist? Some cultures are perfectly happy following the boss. Russian culture is very elitist. I mean, anybody that has a shred of authority or power, you just walk into a room and say what you want. Magically, it appears, it happens. Here, well, you wouldn't. Even the police have trouble getting people to do what they order them to do at gunpoint. It's not a good situation. So egalitarian versus elitist. This is also known as power distance in cross-cultural circles. A high power distance is a deep separation between anybody with authority and someone without that authority. You don't interface. There's not a lot of accessibility in there. Hong Kong policeman, high power distance. You don't mess with him. He'll shoot you. American policeman, low power distance. Where do you get off? Give me a ticket. No, I ain't going with you. Just saying. Mobility versus rigidity in terms of transfer between power levels. Is what ease of movement is there in the social strata? You know, if I marry up, am I automatically part of this higher social level? Distribution versus concentration. Now these are power and wealth paradigms. Is this kind of democratic in its allocation of political power? Well, here it is pretty democratic. Even though in terms of finance, we are increasingly distancing between the poor and the rich, everybody still has a vote. So we're kind of neurotic, I guess, as a political entity. What is their view of time? Oh, this is a nice one. Any of you guys do any missions work in Mexico or the Caribbean or the Indian reservations? Then you know. Indian time is not the same thing as white time. And I'm teasing because my good friends in the Klamath tribe over in Chiloquin tease me about it all the time. Some cultures are task-oriented like ours. Hey, I got a schedule, I got a task, I got a list, I'm getting it done. At 3:05, I'll be at Lowe's. You know, at 3:10, I'll be at PetSmart. I know exactly what I'm doing when. Versus event-oriented, which includes relational interchange. That means that when Juan tells you he's going to show up for the wedding this afternoon, well, the wedding started at 1 o'clock. Juan whips in here at 2:30. Well, he's here, he's hugging, kissing the bride, hugging the groom, cutting the cake and dancing. He's having a good time. For him, it was about being here and interfacing with the people at this wedding. It wasn't about his task to be here on time. He's not visualizing a checklist or a roll call. We're terrible about that. And it's because we're a more productive society. We value production. It's why you guys have to come in at 9 in order to take the quiz. And if you get here at 9:08, you don't get to take the quiz. It's one of the things that a culture differentiates itself in. Task orientation versus event orientation. Is it about production or is it about relation? What's more important, to get the job done or to have a good time with the person you're with? We kind of do both, but there's a lot of pressure on us to produce. We tend to take pleasure in our relationships as a byproduct of the production process. There are some cultures who have long-term goals. There are some cultures that are short-term. Our culture is extremely short-term. Basically, we stopped making the PT Cruiser or one of the Fords because we had sales saturation. And so we don't make that anymore. Doesn't matter, that's the most popular car that we've had in half a century, that and the Mustang. very short-sighted. We're always looking at just, well, what's our profit margin for this quarter? Well, I don't know. It's too long to think about the whole year, the whole fiscal year. Well, there are cultures like Japan, which waited nearly 100 years after Admiral Perry took their face by sailing his fleet into Tokyo Harbor and shaming them. They waited 100 years to come back and bomb the 7th Fleet at Pearl Harbor. That's the thinking here. They're very long-term thinking. Their corporations have 10 and 50-year plans in Japan. They have people who put a down payment on an apartment they will never live to own, but their grandkids will. It's very different. If you haven't encountered this on the mission field or elsewhere, it will shock you when it finally happens. Tradition versus innovation. Just the freedom to change the processes. Again, this will be a function of the high context versus the low context milieu that you're in the middle of. Also, regarding time is a linear versus an instant orientation. Are you about a linear historical interpretation, or do you live in the moment? Islam is a very linear historical interpretation. They're still more angry at each other for what happened to Prince Ali in the 7th century than they are at us. That's what divided the Sunnis from the Shiites. They still hate each other more than they hate us because of something that happened basically 1,400 years ago. So we are much more in the moment. Am I having a good time? And it's increasingly getting that way. You know, I don't want to go to work today. The guys are running up and they're going to do some fishing on Odell. Yeah, that's what I want to do. You know, it's not as productive. It's more enjoyable, but there's a downside to it too. But it is definitely an element you want to be aware of in a culture. Well, there are additional elements, you guys. There's the cultural view of gender, the role and treatment of each sex. There's a view of nature, the role and the function of environment. Is it mine to plunder, or do I want to live in harmony with it, or is there a balance? The view of humanity. Now we're dealing, ethics, ontology, theology. What is the purpose of the human race? How valuable are they? The view of the cosmos, the view of God. All of these things are additional elements that will occur in the cultural onion of an entire community. They will also occur in the cultural onion available within an individual's understanding and worldview. But by being familiar with some of these, fewer of them will take you by surprise, and you will be more quickly ready to deal with some of the ambushes and difficulties that you're going to encounter in any sort of cross-cultural ministry or situation or context. Here are a couple fun cross-culture exercises. If you know that you're going to reach out to a certain cultural area, one is, if you can, this works for Hispanic, and if you ever travel, some German and even a couple Russian stations that are available on cable. Watch foreign language television. Watch how they interact, the characters in their soap operas and stuff. And if you get distracted, turn off the volume. Just what do they do with their hands? What do they do with their bodies? How close do they get? How do their heads move? What about facial expression? When Isla and I did one of those river cruises up the Rhine River and down the Danube, one interesting thing we found, not necessarily a television exercise, was that the farther east we got, as we started going through Austria and entered into the Czech Republic and on down into Slovakia and into Hungary, the farther east we got, the more we encountered a very odd phenomena. People don't smile. Not in public. If you walk into a shop and you smile at somebody or pass somebody, at a sidewalk cafe and just smile down at them, they're going to look at you really weird. The reason, I believe, is because they have been under the thumb of communism and Nazism for so long that their ability to respond just with a trusting spontaneity and friendliness has just been utterly taken away. Once you actually get into some kind of relationship and they understand, oh, you're a customer, oh, you're asking directions, they ease up a little bit. But it was just amazing. I walking down the sidewalks of Budapest you're wondering, gosh, this is worse than New York, man. Everybody's mad at me. It's just how they are. Learning ahead of time how the culture you're targeting behaves and deals in this way is a good thing. So, hey, if you go visit Uncle Elmer and you're staying in the Best Western and you got cable TV, look for a foreign culture, look for a foreign channel, and check that out. Watch it for an hour. You'll be amazed at how entertaining that actually is. You can also eat out at ethnic restaurants. Guys, if you can't find ethnic restaurants in this valley, you are just wrong. We have some awesome places here, Medford, Grants Pass. Our little taco trucks out here. Get down. There must be 80 or 90 separate cultures and subcultures represented in a food context in this place. Check it out. I actually go often enough so you know what your favorite dishes are. There's Thai, there's Greek, there's Spanish, there's Italian, there's Mexican, there's Hungarian, there's Arabic, you name it, you got it. I would encourage you, if you're serious, volunteer at one of the community services, which actually supports that particular cultural or ethnic group. I'm not even going to tell you, it's easy. Go down to Jackson County Human Services, tell them, I'd really like to get more familiar with the juvenile delinquent population or the Hispanic migrant worker population. Have you got any volunteer work and stuff like that? Oh my, be careful what you ask for. There's lots of places you can help. And you can learn a lot about your culture just by doing that. The other thing is to read up on different ethnic groups and begin praying for them. Just pray for them. Get yourself sensitized so that when they show up in the news, you hear about it, you pay attention. You learn when they're being shot at by guerrilla groups. You learn at it when they're being invaded by neighboring tyrants. You learn when they're suffering because their economies are failing. Check it out. It's good to adopt a group or two that you can pray for. Well, I guess that's all I got. You could go on forever and ever in this stuff. Cross-culture ministry is hard, but it's very rewarding. If you go, just learning how to say please and thank you and where's the bathroom in a foreign culture tickles people. That you even went to that much trouble. People want to be loved and they need to be saved. So the better you can get at this, the deeper you can develop your skill set, the more muscular your cross-cultural capacity and quota is. God won't waste that. I promise you that. He'll put you to work. Heavenly Father, we do ask your blessing, and we thank you that you will actually draw us into the experiences that you have designed for us when you first formed us before the foundation of the world. We love you and we trust the path you have brought us on. We ask that you would grant us discernment to both see it and to heed the Spirit's guidance in taking it. That you'd help us place our feet one in front of the other, not needing to see the path so much as understanding the certain destination. We love you and we thank you for all of the things that you have given to us. And we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time, maybe in person.